Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Better Boards webinar. My name is Raphael. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before we start. If anyone could let me know in the chat if they're actually getting us live, that would be really fantastic. So we know that you're seeing us and hearing us. Otherwise, before we start, just remembering that down the bottom you can access questions and topics and make suggestions during Michael's webinar. And you can also respond to polls. He'll be mentioning some of the polls throughout to respond to, but you can also respond all at the start if you'd like. And without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Michael Goldsworthy, talking about the fundamentals of good governance.
Thank you, Raphael. Good afternoon, colleagues, wherever you are around Australia. I trust it's a lot warmer than we here in Melbourne. Today we've got a 1 hour session focusing on the fundamentals of contemporary governance. Today's webinar runs from 1 o'clock to 2. I'll be covering in essence, three areas. What is governance and what are a board's key roles and responsibilities? Number 2, I'll be talking about the governance framework, systems and processes. And number 3, we'll be delving into a few issues around legal entities and their connections to boards. Prior to this event, if you haven't received it, let us know, but we have sent you out a couple of board assessment tools. One is a board or governance due diligence assessment tool, and number 2, it has 2 parts, and number 2 is a board meeting evaluation tool that you might find useful to use either for yourself or in fact your whole board. This webinar will also be available virtually immediately after we finish at 2 o'clock today, and we will also, if you require, be able to send you out some other tools and articles that parallel or support this particular webinar. In terms of polls, there are a couple of, if you click on the little button which says polls on your screen, there's a few questions there. What sort of organisation are you? What state or territory are you from? What's your position in the organisation? And does your organisation have a governance system? A question around board training or professional development. And in fact, a question also around governance reviews and assessments. So there are a few of the polls you might like to actually fill in as we travel through the session today. Let's focus in first up around what is governance, and most importantly, as we focus in on this particular question, really look more closely at the issues around governance and how we progress. Before I do so, I just want to focus quickly in on a couple of acknowledgements. Clearly, everyone on the webinar today is in different places or spaces when it comes to their own board or committee and the governance processes and frames they're using. And obviously, individuals who have joined us today obviously are in different places in regard to their knowledge and understanding or practical application of governance. And of course, a number of you, I know from the listing of participants today, are either incorporated associations, companies limited, some of you are cooperatives, some of you are actually attached to private companies or in fact to legal or consulting groups or government. So a few acknowledgements there. In terms of the objectives of the webinar, primarily it's aimed at really enhancing or strengthening your understanding of your role as a director and focusing also in around particular frameworks or systems, principles and processes that might be applied or practically help you in the boardroom, as well as, most importantly, being able to go forward in terms of tools, documents, resources that can actually assist you undertake this work or enhance your work in the boardroom. In terms of supporting resources that I briefly touched on a moment ago, if you're not familiar with it, there's the Better Boards website and the web address is there on the screen. There's my own website, which has a range of presentations. Some of you will know the tag system and the information that's available there. And of course, I've previously mentioned that this particular recording and other resources are available. Let's move into the question of what is governance and what are the board's key roles and responsibilities. A number of you will be aware that if we wind back to the early 80s, or in fact the 90s, governance was a very new word, particularly for those who were directors or committee members of not-for-profits. In fact, governance was barely spelt, let alone understood. And it's been quite an evolving journey over time for individuals, boards, consultants, advisors, even lawyers to really get their heads around the issue of the process of governance and the framework of governance and the various tools and documents that go with it, let alone, most importantly, its practical application in the boardroom. So I think that's an important consideration to think about before we move into the various definitions. I've pulled together a couple of quick definitions around governance. One there from Standards Australia, which is focused on clearly around directing and controlling and holding to account an organisation. The Macquarie Dictionary, where they speak about steering and guiding as a method of control or a method of government. And one from, in fact, from the Australian Stock Exchange as well. But I suppose my observation back to you, having worked now with close on 7,000 boards over the last 30-odd years, is that governance is increasingly well understood by many directors, albeit the new directors obviously come on and need to get their skills up to speed when it comes to governance. But its actual practical implementation still remains for some directors and some CEOs, or in fact some boards, somewhat of a challenge. The theory's fine, but how do we practically apply and change our work practices, our attitudes, our behaviours in the boardroom to actually put this into practice? When we think about governance, I like to always think of it really as a leadership process. Yes, some people will say, well, you could go to the Corporations Act or the State Associations Acts of each state, and it will be clearly defined from a legislative point of view a range of items and focus that one should take account of when they're governing. But today, when one thinks about governance, I like to think of it as a collective leadership process that's undertaken by a group of individuals. Yes, each individual brings their own leadership style, their own leadership experience and processes, but as a collective, when a board comes together, I see governance much more as that leadership process. I suppose it's within that governance process that we enact our various governance roles and responsibilities. And I'd just like to make the point that for many people, they often forget that it's not just you're a director when you're in the boardroom. You are, in fact, if you've signed up to be a director or a committee member, you are, in fact, a director 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, not just the 12 meetings in the boardroom. Another point you might like to consider when we think of directorship and the leadership process is that you're essentially a custodian or steward on behalf of members. That is, you're hoping to leave the organisation in a far better place than when you were first appointed. But as a director, technically in a not-for-profit, you're not the owner. Occasionally one comes across a chair in particular who behaves or acts in a way that one would nearly believe they in fact own the organisation. It's the members, in fact, who are in fact the true owners. And of course, if you're a director where your directors are also the members and there are no other members, then clearly you're really a director of what we could call a privately owned not-for-profit. Moving on to another quick consideration around this issue around governance and the leadership process, I suppose the big question that one really needs to ask of themselves and fellow board members is there seriously a measurable value and benefit from individual directors sitting around that table? Because as leaders in that collective leadership process, they certainly need to be making a valuable, measurable contribution to the advancement of the organisation and its objectives, its vision and strategy. Let's now turn to the issue of what is a board. A few dot points here, a few considerations. One is that clearly it's a group of skilled, experienced, and often tertiary qualified, but not always. Often just life experience comes to hand as well. But experienced individuals who've really been appointed or elected by members. Although I note right across Australia, increasingly, people aren't just formally elected. There tends to be a whole nomination process and a movement coming about where individual directors are either tapped on the shoulder or come from committees or task forces that they've been on for a while and then are brought up into the board. Clearly, when a director is appointed, great to have an orientation and a board induction. But I think an important point for directors to consider, particularly if you're a new director on a board or about to go onto a board, is to actually, through that induction process and that early orientation, is to actually undertake your own personal due diligence of the organisation. Has it realistically got a strategic plan? Where are they at and where are they really travelling? What does the Constitution actually say? What contracts am I actually going to be, when I sign up as a director, actually be held to account against? What funding or service agreements have we got? Is there potential or actual pending or actual legal proceedings happening at the moment? There's a raft of issues there we could speak about when it comes to personal due diligence, but not to, of course, forget the financial position of the company. I think we're all well aware of the National Safety Council case of where a good person stepped onto a board and 3 months later, of course, the entity was declared insolvent, and unfortunately, the National Safety Council case came down as the prima facie case of a non-profit becoming insolvent, but also of the need for individuals to actually undertake personal due diligence. The other aspect, of course, I'd like to speak about under this area of discussion is understanding not only that we're signing up as a director against particular state or Commonwealth forms and documents that need to be signed, but for a number of you, particularly, for example, if you're in residential aged care or home care, you may well have also signed particular departmental forms, e.g. you've signed up as key personnel. And I'm always somewhat aghast, I suppose would be the word to use, really, at the number of people who signed up on these particular requirements but don't fully understand the breadth and depth of the legislation behind, e.g. being a person who's nominated as a key personnel and what it actually means. An important aspect to consider. Let's move on to the question of what's the purpose of a board, and I've briefly touched on that in my earlier introductory remarks there, that essentially directors or board members are custodians or stewards on behalf of that organisation. And you'll think, when you think about it, over time, obviously directors come and go and the life of the organisation continues. There are not many not-for-profits in Australia that are more than 100 years old. There are a few, but not many. So you see over time, as directors come and go, this stewardship, this concept of custodianship, and those individual directors taking that organisation hopefully forward and up to a better place. Another key purpose or focus of the board, if you think about yourselves as keepers of the vision, of the mission, the core business or the philosophy, whatever words you actually use, whatever statements you have, but essentially that's a platform for individual, team and organisational, and in fact board behaviours and attitudes to be measured against. And that is important, that you not only keep those statements up to date, but they're seen as this organisational platform against which, as I mentioned, individual team, organisational or board behaviours and attitudes are actually measured against. Clearly, the directors are there, elected to guide and direct the organisation, but most importantly comes this issue of we're not there to manage the organisation or its services. And perhaps the greatest acid test that each one of you could undertake, or your board could undertake, is to really review your own minutes with a red pen versus a green pen and say, well, what in reality has been a true strategic discussion or decision versus those aspects and elements of our meeting and decisions where in fact it's really manage the affairs of management. I'll be the first to admit that that line is never a crisp, clear line. It's always a blurred line, and particularly when things go wrong in the organisation, e.g. financially, you'll often see boards delving deep into the organisation to try to understand that organisation and where it's really at. The other point that I just make in closing on this question of what's the purpose of a board is that in reality and in legislation, clearly a board is there to really translate the wishes of its members, that is the owners, into organisational performance. And of course, as we see the decline of membership in many organisations, then the power of membership, the potential of membership is not fully realised, and the role of membership is starting to really evolve and change in non-profits. But it's important to remember, at the end of the day, constitutionally, they are the owners, and you as a director are there to translate their wishes, albeit that they often are not very clear or well known, I'd be the first to admit, but to present their point of view in taking that organisation forward. Let's move on to our next slide, which is slide 11. Just focusing in on continuing this quick aspects or elements of the purpose of the board. I've touched on that it's a voice from ownership, that is for the members, and that's an important concept to get your head around. It's not really a link the other way. That is that the directors tell members what to do. Members ultimately have that legal power and basis. I suppose another thought about the board and its purpose is to ensure that they put their hands around the business, not in the business. They certainly need to understand the business, the services, the products, whatever words you use, and how things are travelling, for sure. But taking a holistic view of the total organisation, not just the services or not just the contract or not just contractual requirements, for example, like in employment services areas, but taking a wider view of the whole organisation is essential. The board's also there, obviously, to focus on ultimately the end result. And some of you would be well familiar with John Carver from America and his very early work in the 90s about promoting the concept of boards setting the end result or the key result area. And of course, through the CEO and senior staff, they develop the strategies or the means or the how those end results are going to be achieved. Some people today call that the desired future, the end result, strategy 2020. What's our end result we're after? And clearly, another important concept or principle is that the board should really drive those strategies, but at the same time, the majority, if not all of those strategies, will be executed and implemented by the CEO and the senior managers. Let's just move on to what are the two key roles of the board. Ultimately, bring it right down to a nutshell. As I see the world of governance, it's really to firstly act in the best interest of the organisation. And I often use a boat analogy here. It's about keeping the boat off the rocks or the ship off the rocks It's about keeping it out of stormy seas. It's about ensuring the boat is strong in all respects. So act in the best interest first and foremost. And secondly, the second key role is to ensure equitable support or resourcing, etc., for the various internal stakeholders. And of course, some of you will have key external stakeholders, be they clients or government departments or other entities. But in essence, they're the two key roles. Keep the boat or the ship off the rocks, acting in the best interest of the organisation at all times. And secondly, and actually ensuring equitable support and resourcing for those stakeholders. Let's move forward onto the 4 key responsibilities. The first two I've slightly touched on when I opened up today around the issue of leadership, and that first key responsibility is around providing the necessary strategic leadership, and we'll unpack that in a moment, and providing policy-based decisions, that is, making decisions that are in line with your governance policies and procedures. And the other two are clearly around monitoring and reviewing, and there's a range of activities and functions there. And of course, then there's the issue of, are we compliant? And secondly, have we got coverage, meaning have we actually got documents and processes in place to ensure our compliance? So 4 key responsibilities and 2 key roles. I've summarised on slide 14 those 4 key responsibilities, but I'd just like to make the point that when you look at the strategic leadership and all the functions underneath that, and making decisions based on your governance policies, both of those are essentially a proactive approach to governing, as distinct from compliance and coverage and monitoring and reviewing. When you look at their particular tasks and functions, then clearly they are reactive, essentially reactive behaviours or reactive processes. And it's often useful to reflect on in our boardroom, really in reality, when we look at once again our minutes and our decisions and our agendas, how much of our work is truly, honestly reactive, looking backwards, what's happened, or where we're at now, as distinct from the proactive about where we're heading and undertaking the necessary strategic thinking, the strategic discussions, and making the strategic decisions. Let's move on to slide 15. Just briefly unpacking, conscious of time, what are the strategic leadership functions? I've raised the number there, but I'll just touch on the words wisdom and common sense, insight and vision, and most importantly, in taking or undertaking this strategic leadership function, these functions, to actually build that relationship with the board and these senior executives or senior managers, the leadership team. A range of different important functions under strategic leadership. If we move on to slide 16, there's a range of other comments or points I've made there, but an interesting one, when you think about organisations that you govern, your organisation will either truly be in mission mode, growing, developing, delivering the goods that or services it needs to, or it's fallen into maintenance mode, much the same, or it's actually sliding down the other way and falling into muddling mode. If we're truly there as strategic leaders, we've got the organisation in mission mode. Occasionally, obviously, after 2 or 3 years, you might have a period of consolidation or maintenance for 12 months or 6 months, but then you'll be up and away, taking the organisation onward and upward, not letting it stand in one position in maintenance, or worse still, getting into muddling mode. And of course, strategic leadership is also about the strategic thinking, the strategic discussion, and the strategic decisions. That's the basis of ultimately developing a practical and realistic strategy as one moves forward. Let's just touch on policy-based decisions. A range of items here to think about, but clearly the majority of all your decisions are made within a framework around the Constitution, legislation and regulation, your own governance policy procedures, and the contracts or service agreements. You could think of that as a broad framework of decision making. Of course, clearly you've got your relevant, or should have your relevant governance policies or procedures, which helps guide you in the discussion. And if your board hasn't got a comprehensive but practical set of governance policy procedures, that's something you might like to look at. But it's critical that ultimately, if you're going to be making decisions, they are based against some particular policies. For example, what is our policy on growth and development? What is our policy on amalgamation or merger? What is our policy on major strategic partnerships? What is the board's view on taking on non-core business? Whatever the particular discussion's about, a number of your governance policy procedures should give you some guidance or a frame to that sort of level of thinking. On slide 18, we just focus on the fourth area of responsibility is around this issue of compliance and coverage. And we could speak at greater length about this, but I suppose in an absolute snapshot there, I've presented a little model which looks at a few key compliance and coverage areas, and at the same time also looks at particular examples. And the last one, when we think about key responsibilities, is this area of monitoring and reviewing. And when you look across non-profits as an absolute generalisation, one of their greatest areas of weakness is, in fact, there are not a set of agreed, standardised KPIs or benchmarks, ratios, whatever you like to call it. But when it comes to performance management system and the actual KPIs, we're often not too good on that. And yes, we might report on the money, but we're not reporting on a range of other organisational performance indicators or targets. And maybe we need to look at that. If any of you have this sort of challenge on your board, feel free to email me in due course. I'm happy to send out free to you a couple of examples of a little dashboard, a performance management scorecarding system that might actually help address this situation. Let's just perhaps take a break for a moment, and there might be one or two questions there that people might, or comments people might like to put forward before I move on to the next section. We've got one question there, an absolute dot point summary of the governance requirements for incorporated associations and companies. ASIC, ACNC, ATO, Consumer Affairs. Well, I don't think we're going to cover all of those, but perhaps a couple of quick points. Incorporated associations, each state has its various acts. In the earlier years, the incorporated association acts were more geared to the tennis club, the footy club, the frog society, whatever. They were never envisaged for the size and scale that many non-profits have developed today. There is some 14% of non-profits now who have moved to companies limited by guarantee, Commonwealth legislation, a much more robust legislation than Incorporated Associations Act, and providing for directors greater through the legislation, both greater requirement and greater guidance when it comes to governance. Let's move on to our next segment, which is segment 2 on slide 20, and it's just coming up now. And it's around the question of what is a governance framework, a governance model, a governance structure, and the systems. One way of thinking about the framework, the parameters in which you work as an individual director, and this isn't certainly the only framework, but it's one way to think about it. If you think about your work as a director and your board's work, you've got your constitution, be it the actual constitution or bylaws or M&A, whatever you run under. There's your actual governance policies and procedures, which set a guide as to how you work and operate. There's the local, state and Commonwealth legislation, and for a number of directors, that's something to just ponder on for a moment, because for many of you, it's not just the Aged Care Act or the Disability Act or the Mental Health Services Act. For many of you, it's in fact a couple of hundred acts that you are legally accountable to and are guided by. Privacy Act, Health and Safety Act, Medications Act, whatever it is. And then, of course, there's particular industry or government standards or quality systems, and increasingly a number of those are ramping up significantly around that word governance and governance requirements. And then, of course, there's actually the contractual agreements you often sign, more typically with government, but sometimes with other organisations. And then, of course, there's the actual board culture, the way that people think, behave and operate. So that's the thought about the framework in which you work. Let's move on to slide 22, talking about the typical governance models. If we look at, I've popped there on the screen, a range of different models. There's no one right or wrong one. But I suppose when you think of, as a generalisation with non-profits, we've moved from a situation of whoever we could get or a more representative approach. We've increasingly moved to what people generally call a skills-based model, acknowledging that, in fact, sometimes that happens at a national level or state level, and sometimes you get a combination of these models as one looks closely at each board. But it's good to reflect upon what is our actual model of governance and what's actually underpinning it. Those typical governance models, as I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You've got to determine your own model, but increasingly many people are moving to a skills-based approach. And when that's been done, it lays the foundation for what's our governance structure, the positions we have, committees or task forces, etc. Slide 24, I'd just like to focus for a moment around this issue of core business or our reason for being. And if ever there's one area that some people struggle with, it is this issue of what is our reason for being, or the raison d'etre. And I just make the point that it's not your product or service area. There's greater depth to it than that. And my best quick example is, in fact, the ambulance system, where their core business is not, in fact, saving lives. That's only a 3% event. It's about running an efficient, effective medical transport system. So for organisations who are able to think about the core business and what it is, it enables you, most importantly, to then say, well, what's the skill sets or positions we need around the board table if this is our core business or our reason for being? And that's why I'm such an advocate of boards working through what is our core business and aligning that back to their particular positions on the board and how they fill those positions. Turning to governance structure, if your board hasn't already documented its governance structure, it's a practical and good thing to do. It helps individuals throughout the organisation to actually understand not only who are the members, where they fit as against the board, as against the CEO, but if we have particular committees that do the work of the board, or we have particular task forces, then they're documented. And in fact, a number of those, if not all of them, should also have terms of reference as well. But it's a good way to make sure that everyone's clear about the various undertakings of the board, be it via the board or via committees or via task forces, and what the reporting lines are as well. Remembering that committees and task forces do not usurp the power of the board. They are primarily there to do the work of the board. And task forces being there primarily, obviously, with a short, sharp focus, start date, finish date. The value of boards, committees in particular, is that they obviously can undertake the work of the board, be it a clinical governance committee or an audit risk committee, etc. They're there to do the work of the board and report back. The point I make here is the danger is that a committee undertakes all its work, develops a report, be it verbal or written, goes to the board, and the board then reworks all that material when in fact this committee has already done all the work. So if you are in that situation, be sure that your committee has clear terms of reference, clear reporting requirements, and that on your board side, in your governance policies and procedures, there's absolute clarity about how the board committees, or in fact task forces, work, and that the board is not there to rework the work of those committees or task forces. Here's an interesting one. How does the board actually work? And I suppose I come from somewhat of a mechanical process diagram here, and I might even move forward for a moment onto slide 28 because it visually is a little larger, and hopefully a number of you will be able to see there that on the top we've got the board, the top circle, the board with their governance policy and procedures. They have meetings, they take proposals, they have ideas, and they put those ideas down to the CEO, or it's possible in the bottom circle, the CEO and the executives have developed particular policies or developed particular papers or particular business cases or ideas, and they put them up to the board. The board thinks about them, talks about them in line with its policy, its framework, its strategy, its key direction, and then pop it down back to the CEO for either implementation, or if that's not approved, then clearly the CEO's got to go back to the drawing board. But it's essentially a figure of eight process that one can consider when you think about globally how that board works and interacts with the CEO and the rest of the organisation. In working with the organisation, it's increasingly common for boards to establish what I'd call a leadership team, where we've got the board, the CEO, and the senior team or executives, whatever word you use, working together on the current and the future strategic challenges or strategic opportunities. It's really bringing the best of the primary intellectual capital of the board, the CEO, the exec team together to work on the organisation, on its future, on those big internal or external challenges or opportunities. And the power of leadership team is certainly one that I have seen work incredibly well, respecting the fact that each entity has its own particular tasks and responsibilities. Let's now reflect briefly on governance systems, and there's a range of governance systems available. There are, in fact, more than 5 available, but the key ones that are widely known across Australia is the Australian Stock Exchange Corporate Governance Principles, or there's the Corporate Governance Standards. There's our own system we've built, TAGS, the Australian Governance System, which in fact a number of you have. There's the Carver model, or the American Governance System, and the Australian National Audit Office System. There are a range of others that have more recently come out as well. But if you haven't got a governance system, then most importantly, and those policy procedures aren't in place, this is something you might like to think about. Slide 31, I won't go through, but it just gives you an indicator of an assessment process that we went through some years back, quite an extensive process, in fact, to cross-correlate at a very high level, ultimately, where each of those systems stood with policies and procedures. If you'd like more information on this, let me know in due course. What are the elements of your governance system? Some people just operate on governance principles. Other organisations have the governance principles and governance policy and procedures. Some has gone as far as having tools or templates, board position descriptions, terms of reference, etc. But most importantly, whatever your governance system is, it needs to have the necessary components and how they actually come together to help that board actually work. Let's move on to slide 33, which is just briefly, there's some notes there you can reflect on yourself later on. But it really just makes the point that prior to the early 90s, boards really tended to work within the organisational operational policies and procedures. And it wasn't until more recent years that we really had a difference between the governance policies and procedures and the organisational policies and procedures. And when you've got both of those, the question is, how do you collate and manage and distribute and report on all that documentation? In terms of systems and their interconnection to the board, every organisation will vary, and clearly the board's role is not to get into the detail of all those systems, but a number of those systems should be able to give you timely and accurate reports or information about how the organisation's travelling, where things are at, and most importantly, if we haven't got those systems in place, then we may not well be getting the right data or information, and it's clearly not just only from the finances. Those systems, in essence, I like to think of them as an iceberg. Each system is an iceberg in its own right, because if we thought of the human resource management or HR system, there's some key questions there for the board. How many people on the payroll? How many people on workers' comp? What's the average length of sick leave? On it goes. That's the key sort of strategic data you might be after, whereas an awful lot of other data is under the waterline that just management and staff need to know. You certainly don't need to get involved in. But these systems really, I think, ultimately provide, and I use the analogy of the iceberg, an opportunity to take that strategic / broader organisational data and information. Before we move into the last section, let's go back to a few questions. Content seems to be suited for large organisations. How can small and not-for-profits who may not have that kind of resource to hire staff have a CO? How could they actually gain resource? Just a couple of points there to think about. Number one is whether you're small, medium or large, the legislation and regulation, etc., is all the same. It's equally and evenly applied. I clearly recognise that smaller organisations, tiny non-profits particularly, have very limited resources, but that's not to say that you can't put in place governance policies or procedures or tools. There's quite a number of those available on the web that are free. There's a number of organisations who help other organisations, but it behoves you, whether you're a director of small, medium or large, you still have the same legal responsibilities, there's still the same obligations, morally, ethically and legally. As I've mentioned, a number of these roles and responsibilities. If I think it's Chevron there, would like some further information on that, please feel free to email me and I'll be happy to forward you a few other resources and ideas that might actually help going forward. Let's now turn to the issue around the typical legal entities that boards operate within. And I'll just cover off on a couple of those as we move toward the rest of the session. Clearly, there's incorporated associations, and I touched on those earlier, in that they're state-based. They're typically were in the original state constructed there for small groups, small social groups, community groups, etc., etc. But as organisations have grown and become more complex, become multi-state, etc., they've moved into becoming companies limited by guarantee, And personally, I think we will see the day in the not too distant future where, in fact, for many organisations, as with a disability, mental health, aged care, etc., as they move into a more competitive marketplace, I think we'll see more and more of them moving to companies limited by guarantee, where directors will in fact be under the corporations legislation. There's obviously co-ops there that relate to non-profits. Co-ops in two forms, co-ops where there's shareholding, and co-ops where in fact there's no shareholding and they're technically a not-for-profit. And of course the other area that not-for-profits act under is if you're a church charitable organisation, is the Acts of Parliament. Of course, the majority, but not all, religious organisations act or govern under Acts of Parliament that are specifically put in place for that organisation or those organisations. Let's just have a quick look at companies limited by guarantee. What's happening across Australia. The same in the committees of management or incorporated associations. You're starting to see much smaller boards, boards coming down from 12 to 5 to 7. Increasingly, as I mentioned earlier, board specialist skills, more technical skills. I make the point that even though they are legally companies, yes, they've got to balance and integrate all these business objectives and outcomes with the service objectives and outcomes. They're there ultimately for a social dividend, but there's no doubt more and more they've also got to be able to produce that financial dividend that supports or underpins the the service dividend. Let's move on from there and have a quick look. I've touched on the issue of Acts of Parliament and not-for-profits, and there's some notes there that individuals might like to read on those. I've also put in a couple of other notes there on proprietary limited companies, where there's a limited number of shareholders and directors, and some of you would be well familiar with those, or family trusts. And the same with public companies. I've put a few dot points there for people just so they distinguish the difference between those and non-profits. The other reason I've included those is because as we move for many organisations into a customer-driven competitive marketplace, which many non-profits are in fact doing, we're coming up in competition against private and public companies, and it's good to start to understand some of their governance frameworks and structures as we go forward. The other legal entity is, of course, where we see all sorts of human service or social or community service undertakings is through state and Commonwealth and local government, although increasingly, of course, as we know, local government is increasingly in many areas, not all, but in many areas, removing itself from direct service provision and handing it over to non-profits, or in fact putting it out to tender or contract, and the same in the states. And for the Commonwealth, for the vast bulk of things like childcare, aged care, disability, employment, etc., they don't undertake that anymore, although they run a range of government authorities or boards for a vast array of administrative and legislative approaches. I'm conscious of the time. It's just on nearly 10:02. Let's just return back for a moment to questions, because I'm keen to see if we've got any other questions there. Here's an interesting one from Marley. What is a legal definition of a social enterprise, and what legal entity is required? Marley, gosh, there's some significant writing around social enterprise. Is it without government money? Is it with government money? I couldn't answer from a purely legal point of view, except to say that all the in inverted commas social enterprises that I've come across are either incorporated associations or companies limited by guarantee or cooperatives. But the fact is, if they're going to undertake any product or service operations in the marketplace. They clearly need to be held in a legal. That undertaking needs to be held in a legal entity. Here's another one. Can you talk to staff representative positions on boards? Pros and cons. Good governance practice or conflicts? Up front, Mary. Mary asked this one. Mary, up front, I categorically believe that staff should not be on boards of non-profits. The members employ, in inverted commas, the board. The board employs the CEO, and if you're large enough, the CEO is employed by the board. The senior staff or executives are employed by the CEO, and of course, managers employ staff, and there is always significant conflicts of interest and problems, I believe, when staff are on boards. I'm a huge advocate of separating that out. It was a model of the past. It's pretty uncommon now, although occasionally one finds the odd one or two organisations who have staff still on their boards. Abby's asked the question around creating good governance around fundraising and connecting with corporate partners. A broad question there, Abby. I think fundamentally, going back to the practical side of things, would be to make sure you've got the necessary governance policies and procedures in place around fundraising, donations, bequests, etc. Because in each state, and in fact across the Commonwealth, there is various legislative frames and requirements on fundraising, donations, sponsorships, bequests, etc. And so one needs to not just understand that legislation, but what's our actual board's governance policies and procedures around all this, and even down to the detail of what's the policy and procedure around fraud, corruption, etc. Theft. Don't underestimate that these things happen in non-profit. So good information around policy there to guide the board in fundraising important. Even, believe it or not, when you think about it more deeply, having adequate whistleblower policy or procedure. There's been many a charity fundraising event that's been damaged significantly, or the organisation's been damaged because of monies and other things that have gone astray. So good policy and procedure there is important. And connecting with those corporate partners is, I believe, all about having clear relationships, clear understandings of their requirements, their expectations, their deliverables, because it's about a zone of mutual benefit in having a partner. So there's got to be wins and benefits for both parties. Let's just see if there's any other one or two questions there that haven't been answered, or I might be able to answer as we start moving toward a wind-up. There doesn't seem to be any other questions at the moment. Let's just move back to our slides. And as I draw to a close, I want to just put you a couple of quick concluding thoughts around governance. Hopefully, depending on your screen and your resolution, you might be able to see that I've put up a ship there, SS Community Business, the non-profit ship. And I put that up as an analogy because ultimately it's all about ensuring as directors, we, as I previously mentioned, keep that ship off the rocks, keep it well founded and keep it well focused on what it's doing and where it's heading. So for the board or as a director, it's really about putting our hands around the business, not in the business. It's about that we work on the business, not in it. And they're important concepts to really get our heads around. We're there to govern, not manage. We're there to focus on the future, not flounder in fear of that. We will often see directors who are unsure about the future position of the company or the organisation, where it's at, where it's heading, let alone where that industry is going toward. We need to be bold and brave in understanding that future. And of course, for the odd one or two boards or organisations who are still walking backwards into their glorious past, then there's clearly no focus on the future. Developing and driving that vision and mission, providing a basis there for the strategy, the platform for strategy to come off is critical. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, you're the keeper of all that. But most importantly, I think at the end of the day, that vision, mission, values, you can never walk away from that. That is the platform for individual, team and organisational and directors' behaviours and work, let alone the strategy building. And of course, as I say there in concluding that whilst you're governing, the management has really got to manage that organisation and take it forward. There's a question here from Mary about talk to difficulties and considerations around working both within and outside Australia. Not quite clear on what sort of difficulties or considerations you're talking about there, Mary, but I'll hazard a guess. We're probably talking governance, I presume. There's a number of non-profits who are currently are in fact overseas, e.g. with employment contracts, or they might be delivering certain services. I can think of Mary and McKillop, their East Timorese group, who work in East Timor. And they're clearly, when they're working in other countries, they're working under their legislation and their jurisdiction. And one needs to be aware of that, because ultimately it's that triangle of risk, reward and responsibility. It's not all risk and it's not all responsibility. You're there possibly for a social dividend or something else, but those different countries have different legislations and different approaches as to how they undertake their work. And I would have thought it's going to be very important to understand their world. Looks like Mary's come back there with a comment about companies limited. Is it the best option? And jurisdictional differences. I would have thought, Mary, that number one, lease being a company under the Australian Securities Commission within that Corporations Act might have been a better option working overseas than working in just a state-based incorporated association with legislation which is, if I use the word, lesser or / weaker in its time. We're just moving toward a closure at 2 o'clock, but I just draw your attention to behind these slides that you have been viewing. I have put together a range of just practical improvement ideas. I won't go through them all. One around legal entity, governance structure, core business, getting terms of reference up, developing, operating a leadership group, using a governance system if you haven't got one, closing the gap between the way we work versus our actual policies and procedures, using a planning system, and we haven't touched really on strategic planning at all today, but it's vital as a vital mechanism, a vital process of the board strategy and strategic planning. If you haven't got a quality management system or some way of housing all your governance policies and procedures, an electronic boardroom, files and paper are definitely dropping out as people move more and more to iPads and similar approaches. There's the board annual program of work, and that's not just a list of dates, but that actually lists out the various functions and tasks of the board over the year against each quarter or month, or however many times you meet. If you're after a tool there, please email me and I'll shoot you one as well. I won't go on much more about that. There's the issue of the annual board training plan, the board self-assessment, and I've sent out a couple of tools to you earlier this morning. They may, if you haven't got them, please let me know. The board budget. So often we see boards that actually don't have a budget. If we had a budget, that would feed into our organisation's budget. But having the board budget is crucial, and aligning that budget into the financial plan that can then be put against the strategic plan. And of course, most importantly, that the agenda is structured back against the board program of work. Of course, you can also obviously forward your directors individual articles, and there's plenty these days on the web that are short, sharp, and easy to read, e.g. The Better Boards newsletter, for example, from there. So we're drawing to a close. Thank you for all those who've joined us today from around Australia. I trust it's been useful, focused, and most importantly, has either enhanced your knowledge or has confirmed what you already know. Please feel free to contact myself or Julia. Her details are on the screen there for any further information, tools, or articles that we can assist you with. And once again, thank you for joining us. Trust it's been useful, and certainly look back to your feedback. And before I close, I remind you that this broadcast is available some 15 minutes after I close off today. Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon.